Today, we'll explore a 2016 sci-fi romance drama titled Passengers. The interstellar spaceship Avalon is seen voyaging through deep space, en route to the distant colony world Homestead 2. The ship is completely automated, with its 258 crew members and 5,000 passengers in hibernation. However, as it moves through an asteroid belt, its shields begin to weaken. In response, power is redirected to the main shield, but the vessel remains on a collision course with a massive asteroid. The inevitable impact triggers multiple system malfunctions, prompting the ship to initiate self-repairs. Amidst this process, one of the hibernation pods unexpectedly activates. Inside is Jim Preston, a mechanical engineer. As he wakes, an automated system guides him through the process, informing him that he has been in suspended animation for 120 years and is now just 4 months away from arrival. The system reassures him that he can now enjoy the ship's many luxuries while awaiting their destination. He receives instructions on using his ID band, locating his assigned cabin, and participating in onboard activities before landing. Eager yet apprehensive about meeting his fellow passengers, Jim prepares himself and steps out of his cabin, only to find himself alone in a classroom designed for an entire group. A holographic instructor explains Earth's conditions, describing it as overcrowded, expensive, and overrated, before instructing him to save his questions for later. However, Jim persistently asks why no one else is present. Realizing the hologram cannot answer, he sets off in search of other people. Reaching the ship's main concourse, he finds it completely deserted. An automated information desk offers assistance, but when Jim requests to speak with a real person, it directs him to a steward, who is also nowhere to be found. Desperate, he asks for the captain, but upon arriving at the bridge, he discovers that none of the main crew have awakened either. Jim eventually makes his way to the observatory, where he learns a shocking truth. Avalon is still 90 years away from Homestead 2. Realizing he has woken far too soon, panic sets in. Rushing back to the concourse, he desperately sends a message to Earth, seeking guidance on how to re-enter hibernation. The system responds with another devastating blow. The message will take 55 years to receive a reply. Overwhelmed, Jim is left in despair. As Jim wanders through the ship, he eventually stumbles upon the bar, where he finally sees another person. However, as he starts a conversation with the bartender, something feels off. When the bartender prepares his drink, Jim realizes the truth: he's an android. The android introduces himself as Arthur. Jim is eager to gather information, but he struggles to even explain his own situation, how he woke up decades too early. The next morning, Jim wakes up in his cabin and heads to the cafeteria, only to quickly learn that most of the menu items are exclusive to gold-class passengers. Stuck with a simple coffee, he turns his focus to figuring out how to fix his hibernation pod. Gathering the necessary tools, he gets the pod up and running and lies inside, hoping to return to hibernation. But nothing happens. Determined, he attempts to break into the ship's crew hibernation chambers using the tools he found, but that, too, proves unsuccessful. Meanwhile, small malfunctions continue to occur throughout the ship. Feeling hopeless, Jim frequently returns to the bar, not just for drinks, but for conversations with Arthur. The android, in an attempt to cheer him up, suggests he enjoy the luxuries of the ship. Taking the advice, Jim sneaks into a gold-class suite and indulges in everything the ship has to offer: fancy restaurants, games, and the entertainment system. But no matter how many distractions he finds, the loneliness continues to weigh on him. One night, after drinking heavily, he stumbles through the hibernation bay and finds himself near an airlock containing spacesuits meant for spacewalks. Curious, he suits up, steps into the airlock, and presses the button to release the outer door. Once outside, he is overwhelmed by the breathtaking sight of deep space. In that moment, he is the only conscious human experiencing this vast, infinite view. Letting go of the magnetic locks on his boots, he floats freely in space, completely lost in his despair. Returning inside, he removes the spacesuit but soon finds himself back at the airlock, this time without it. He grips the lever, prepared to end it all. But at the last second, he hesitates, stumbles backward, and slips on a bottle. As he pulls himself up, his eyes land on one of the hibernation pots. Inside is a woman named Aurora. Intrigued, Jim searches for her files in the passenger directory and listens to her interview. He is captivated by her story, and later, he sits beside her pod, replaying her interviews over and over. Back at the bar, he reads her writing and discusses it with Arthur. The irony of his situation haunts him. He left Earth in search of a better life, only to wake up too soon, alone, and now he has found the perfect woman, but she remains just out of reach. As days pass, Jim becomes fixated on her. He wrestles with a troubling idea: waking her up. He confides in Arthur, who, being an android, fails to grasp the moral dilemma. If he wakes her, she'll be trapped alongside him, doomed to live out her days on the ship. At first, Jim resists the temptation, but as time drags on, he can't shake the thought. Until one day, he makes his decision. Standing before her pod, he overrides the system and activates it. As Aurora begins waking up and goes through the same process Jim did, he quickly hides and retreats to his cabin. A little while later, he heads to the main concourse, hoping to see her. Sure enough, there she is, just as confused and disoriented as he was a year earlier. Jim approaches and explains that they are the only two people awake. He takes her to the observatory, where he reveals that he has no way to access the crew or the ship's main controls. Panicked, Aurora insists on returning to her pod. When they arrive, Jim explains the harsh truth: there is no equipment on board capable of putting them back into hibernation. They're stranded. Back at the concourse, Jim suggests she get some rest since she has just emerged from hibernation. Seeing his loneliness, she sympathizes with him, realizing he has spent over a year completely alone. Meanwhile, Jim returns to the bar, weighed down by guilt. He pleads with Arthur to never reveal that he was the one who woke her up. The next morning, Aurora wakes up and goes to the concourse, seeking answers. She asks the automated information desk about the hibernation pods. Jim soon joins her, and they head to breakfast together. As they walk away, the information desk briefly malfunctions. At the cafeteria, Aurora realizes that Jim has been eating the same basic meal for over a year. She uses her access to get him a gold-class breakfast. They discuss the possibility of fixing the pods, but unlike Jim, Aurora refuses to give up. Determined, she searches the infirmary, combs through research documents, and eventually attempts to force open the crew's hibernation quarters. Jim, meanwhile, notices an increasing number of malfunctions across the ship. Sometime later, Aurora reflects on her life aboard Avalon. She writes, jogs through the ship, and swims in the pool, gradually becoming more aware of the reality of her situation. One day, she sits down with Jim in the cafeteria, deciding to interview him. She believes his story might be worth telling. When she asks why he chose to leave Earth, he initially responds with corporate slogans. But as they talk further, he opens up. He wanted a fresh start, a chance to be someone, to build a life on a new world. Later, while in the observatory, Aurora finally shares her own reason for making the journey. Unlike the other passengers, she has a round-trip ticket. Her goal was to travel to Homestead 2, spend a year there, then return to Earth to become the first journalist to document the entire experience, writing the greatest story ever told. As time passes, Aurora gradually starts to lose hope of finding a solution. Sensing her frustration, Jim tries to lift her spirits. He takes her dancing, to the cinema, and even to the basketball court. Finally, he brings her to the bar to meet Arthur. For a moment, she relaxes, enjoying herself. But reality quickly sinks back in. As she falls silent, lost in thought, Jim is left alone with the android. Overwhelmed with guilt for what he has done to Aurora, Jim struggles with his emotions. Later, he is seen working on something in secret. When Aurora walks into the observatory, she finds a miniature replica of the Chrysler building that he crafted just for her. Some time passes, and they go on a date at the bar. Over dinner, they share stories from their pasts. Aurora opens up about losing her father when she was a teenager. Afterward, Jim leads her to the airlock, where they suit up for a spacewalk. This time, he isn't experiencing the vastness of space alone. He finally has someone to share the breathtaking moment with. Floating weightlessly, they switch off the magnets on their boots and drift together in the void. When they return inside, passion takes over. They kiss, retreat to Jim's cabin, and spend the night together. Soon, they begin living as a couple. Aurora moves into his cabin, documenting her life on the ship through her writing. They jog together, share meals, and fall into a routine. While exploring more of Avalon, Jim stumbles upon the hydroponics bay and surprises Aurora with flowers. One day, as the ship passes by a massive red giant, they head to the observatory to witness the incredible sight. That night, they celebrate Aurora's birthday with a special dinner at one of the ship's restaurants, followed by drinks at the bar. While Aurora chats with Arthur, Jim steps away to the restroom to prepare a ring he made for her. However, in his absence, Arthur unintentionally reveals the truth. Jim was the one who woke her up. Unaware that this was meant to remain a secret, the android's words leave Aurora stunned. Just then, Jim returns, only to be met with her furious, devastated glare. She confronts him in utter disbelief. Overcome with rage, she storms out, leaving Jim helpless. When he returns to his cabin, he finds all of her belongings gone. The next day, he spots her in the cafeteria and tries to speak to her, but she immediately flees. Aurora is consumed by anger and desperation. One night, unable to contain her fury, she barges into Jim's cabin, hitting and kicking him in a blind rage, screaming that she wants to kill him. Jim tries reaching out to her, but she refuses to listen. He attempts to explain, telling her that he fell in love with her, but his words mean nothing to her. He stole her future, and she can't forgive him for it. Then, everything changes. While Jim sits alone in his cabin, a critical malfunction strikes the ship. The main command system shuts down. Later, he steps into an elevator, only for it to malfunction mid-ride. Meanwhile, Aurora walks into the main concourse and is shocked to find that Jim has planted a tree there. At the cafeteria, she notices that the food dispensers are also failing. Suddenly, a voice echoes over the ship's comm system. It's the deck chief, asking who planted the tree. Both Jim and Aurora rush to the concourse, where they see a man standing in front of the tree. Gus Mancuso. Introducing themselves, they quickly bring Gus up to speed on their situation. But he is perplexed. 3 hibernation pods failing at random is unheard of. He leads them to the bridge, where he makes a startling discovery. Jim, Aurora, and Mancuso realize that something is seriously wrong with the ship, but to fully diagnose the issue, they need to manually check the system data. As they leave the bridge, a maintenance robot nearly crashes down on them. Jim and Aurora tell Mancuso that these malfunctions have been occurring more frequently. Concerned, Mancuso explains that this shouldn't be happening. He then teaches them how to collect the necessary data. Later, while inspecting the hibernation pods, Mancuso uncovers what Jim did to Aurora's pod. Disgusted by Jim's actions, he makes his disapproval clear. Back on the bridge, Mancuso analyzes the collected data, and Aurora joins him. She presses him about her pod's failure, but he regretfully tells her there's nothing he can do to reverse what happened. Jim arrives, carrying yet another broken maintenance robot, the 16th one. Mancuso, still suffering from the effects of hibernation sickness, decides to rest. But as he steps away, he suddenly coughs up blood. That night, unable to sleep, Aurora goes for a swim. Out of nowhere, the ship experiences a loss of gravity. The water in the pool detaches and begins floating in massive bubbles, trapping her inside. She struggles to escape, nearly drowning as the water engulfs her. At the last moment, the gravity drive resets, and she barely makes it out alive. Panicked, she runs into Jim, who is also rushing to find Mancuso. Together, they return to the bridge, where they continue to piece together what's been happening. Mancuso determines that a major system failure occurred 2 years ago. Since then, the ship has been compensating, but its systems are being pushed beyond their limits. If they don't locate and fix the root cause soon, Avalon will be completely crippled. They set out to find the malfunction, but before they can, Mancuso collapses. Jim and Aurora rush him to the infirmary, only to receive devastating news. His condition is terminal, and there's nothing that can be done to prolong his life. Later, the 3 of them gather in the observatory. Knowing his time is up, Mancuso hands Jim his ID bracelet, urging them to fix the ship before it's too late. Moments later, he passes away. Suddenly, the ship's lights turn red, alarms blare, and the vessel begins to tremble. Jim realizes he needs Aurora's help, and they race toward engineering. But before they can get there, another system failure hits the gravity drive. At the same time, Arthur, the android bartender, begins malfunctioning as well. Jim is forced to deactivate him. Upon reaching engineering, they start searching for the issue. They soon discover that the problem originates in the power plant. As they open a hatch to investigate, Aurora is suddenly pulled inside. There's a breach in the hull caused by the asteroid impact. Jim is nearly sucked in as well, barely managing to hold onto the hatch as it slams shut on him. Eventually, he loses his grip and is pulled into the damaged section. Thinking quickly, they manage to seal the breach before any further damage is done. But Jim immediately realizes the worst. It's not just one breach. The damage is more extensive than they thought. Following the asteroid's impact trajectory, they track it to its final, most devastating point of contact, the reactor control system. Jim believes he can replace the damaged part of the reactor control system. After locating the component, they install it, but the reactor venting process still fails. They attempt to vent it manually, but that, too, is unsuccessful. Jim then realizes that the only way to cool the reactor is to open the vent door from outside the ship. At the airlock, as he prepares for the spacewalk, he hands Aurora Mancuso's ID bracelet, knowing there's a chance he won't make it back. She helps him suit up, and just before he steps into the airlock, she pleads with him to return, telling him she can't survive on the ship without him. While Aurora monitors the situation from the reactor room, the temperature continues to rise dangerously. A sudden bolt from the overheated reactor strikes her arm, injuring her. Meanwhile, Jim reaches the vent door and starts working to bypass its controls. Realizing the mechanism won't open on its own, he comes to a grim conclusion. He will have to hold the vent open manually for the process to work. He tells Aurora, but she immediately protests, unwilling to let him sacrifice himself. They argue, but Jim insists that saving the lives of the 5,000 passengers and crew is more important. Reluctantly, Aurora initiates the venting process. The plan works, But the powerful release of reactor fumes blasts Jim away from the ship, snapping his tether. His suit's pressure begins to drop, and he radios Aurora to tell her what happened. Frantic, she rushes to retrieve another spacesuit and heads to the airlock to bring him back. Before she leaves, he apologizes to her one last time. Aurora launches into space to reach him, but her tether is too short, pulling her back. Just as it seems she won't make it, she manages to grab hold of Jim's drifting tether and pulls him in. Dragging him into the infirmary, she desperately tries to revive him, only to realize he's already gone. In a final, desperate attempt, she uses Mancuso's bracelet to override the medical protocols and activate the pod's emergency resuscitation process. The automated system does its job, bringing Jim back to life. Overcome with relief, Aurora forgives him. Later, Aurora repairs Arthur, and together, they give Mancuso a proper space burial. Jim then takes Aurora to the infirmary, revealing that he has found a way to use the medical pod as a hibernation chamber. He tells her she can go back into suspended animation and sleep through the rest of the journey. However, she ultimately chooses to stay awake with him. Jim finally proposes, and the two spend the rest of their lives together on the ship. 88 years later, the Avalon reaches Homestead too. When the crew awakens, they are met with an astonishing sight. The ship is no longer as they left it. Aurora leaves behind a message, recounting the story of the life she and Jim shared while everyone else was asleep.